This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on Prime Minister's address at United Nations General Assembly. The participants are Ashok Tandon, political analyst, and AIR correspondent Anand Chaturvedi.
Mr. Tandon, Prime Minister Modi today at the UNGA address, which was the 75th year of the United Nations, asserted that the world cannot fight today's challenges without outdated structures. Highlighted that the United Nations today faces a crisis of confidence, and he urged for reformed multilateralism. What do you have to say on that?
Prime Minister, in fact, made a very candid presentation before the world community when he said that the challenges before the world when the United Nations were formed were different, everything was different, but today is in the 21st century and we are to discuss about our present and our future, and our challenges are different. He said the big question before the world community today is whether the UN is relevant in today's scenario. And he said there have been changes in 75 years. There have been, of course, no doubt, a lot of achievements. But the question is whether there is a need for introspection. He said that there has been no Third World War, but there have been many wars, particularly a number of terrorist attacks, bloodbaths in which many people have died, innocent children have lost their lives. And I think the question the Prime Minister asked the world community was that were the United Nations response to such challenges was enough? And then he also said in the context of the corona in the last 6 months, whether the global community got very adequate and effective response from the United Nations. So therefore he said, now we have to change the system of United Nations and change the shape also. He said Indians respect the United Nations, they have full confidence in the UN body. But the fact is that how long Indians can wait? And the reform process which Indians have been promised is not taking shape. And therefore, he said all Indian people are getting worried because this is not being taken to any logical conclusion. And how long can we be out of the decision-making process? So basically the Prime Minister was focusing on a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council to India. Without saying so, he said India is the largest democracy, 18% of the population in the world, and we have more than 100 languages, many religions, and our ideologies have in fact helped the whole world to restore peace. Even in the economic situation, when we were not enough self-sufficient, but we never became burden on anybody. And when we were powerful, we never made anybody slave or anything. So I think the Prime Minister's emphasis today was to tell the developed countries who are dominating the UN Security Council with their veto power that we can't wait for long. We have waited for a long. Therefore, now it's time that India's role should be defined and we should be given a very meaningful role in the decision-making process. He said the UN and their ideology, and India's ideology and our philosophy are the same. We believe in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that is the whole world is our family, that is our cultural identity, and the global good, Vishwa Kalyan, has always been our motto. We have always worked for peace. We have contributed peacekeeping forces in more than 50 countries' peacekeeping mission, and maximum loss of our soldiers has been in the peacekeeping mission. So every Indian today, in fact, waiting for the reform process. But then he said our contribution, making October 2nd as a non-violence day of UN, 21st June as yoga, on all these, even on disaster management, international solar alliances, we have contributed on every respect. And therefore, time that the world recognizes India's contribution and gives India its due recognition and role in the global affairs, whether it was our Look East policy and whether it was neighborhood policy, whether it was Indo-Pacific relations. On every front, our partnership has always been for the good of the people, our friendship and all these things, the cooperation of development, our development journey is also for the good of the society. So in that context, he brought in the COVID-19 and he said, India has been cooperating with the rest of the world, sharing information about it. India pharmaceutical companies have provided medical equipment and other things to more than 150 countries. And then he said, India being the largest producer of vaccine, he is assured, particularly our neighbors and the developing countries, that whenever a vaccine is available, India will help the rest of the world and all these countries to come out of this. He said the phase 3 clinical trials of our vaccine are at a very advanced stage. We are also developing the capabilities of distribution and helping others.
Mr. Tandon, UN General Assembly recently adopted a forward-looking political declaration that gave a clarion call for strengthening mechanism to combat terrorism, and most relevant of them was like reforming of the UN itself, which the Prime Minister emphasized again and again in his speech. So how do you view this in the light when former Prime Minister even Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, in his last address which he made in UNGA in 2003, he said that the reform is much needed at the United Nations and also cited the example of Iraq. So how do you assess that? How long is it going to take and what will be the prospect?
I think all our former prime ministers have been making pitch for the UN reforms, particularly of the Security Council, in fact taking claim to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. But never before has any prime minister made this pitch in such a strong word. In fact, Prime Minister today was so forthright, candid, and in fact literally cautioning the world community that how long India is going to wait. So he said all of our efforts have been for peace and security and development, human welfare, whether it is arms smuggling, whether it is drug, whether it is narcotics, whether it is all these things, India have been playing a leading role and we have been helping the other developing countries. Our journey of development is to strengthen the global welfare. We have come to a situation when we do need it desperately, and I think I have never come across such a very candid and forthright assertion as far as the reform process is concerned.
Prime Minister emphasized on the peace, security and prosperity motto that the Indian government and India has always been preaching about, and its action against terrorism, drugs and money laundering particularly. And he also emphatically said for how long will India be kept actually away from the decision-making body of the United Nations, speaking about the United Nations Security Council. So what do you have to say on that?
Prime Minister also listed the achievements of his own government. He said in the last 5 years, 400 million people have been linked with the banking system. In around 5 years, 600 million people have been freed from OFD. In fact, it was a difficult task, but India has done it. In the last 2 to 3 years, 500 million people have been provided free health care. India has done it. And digital transactions is a leading player. And therefore, by 2025, every citizen will be free from TB. A campaign has been launched. And in our villages, 150 million houses are now being provided drinking water. 6 lakh villages linked with broadband optic fiber. So these achievements, in fact, also to make a point that we are no longer a country of the snake charmers, and therefore we have a role to play. And then he said, in the pandemic, our Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign is not only for the good of the people of India, but also for the rest of the world. And he promised that all the benefits which we will be getting, and they will be for the world welfare. Prime Minister also talked about the women empowerment in India, and big efforts are being made as far as the Indian women are concerned. The microfinancing system India has launched, women are the biggest beneficiary. Now in India, 26-week paid maternity leave. This was basically to tell the whole world what India is, how India has progressed. 75th year of our independence, and we are going to share our experiences with the rest of the world. Our development process is for the good of the people, and then at the end he called upon the world community, let's rededicate ourselves for a balanced United Nations, empowered United Nations, and let in the 75th year of UN, we dedicate ourselves for the global good and the welfare of the humanity. So I think it was a very touching speech, which was basically meant to tell the whole world, particularly our neighbors and also the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, there is the time now to recognize India and give its due place in the community of nations.
Mr. Tandon, Prime Minister Mr. Modi, he's the second Prime Minister of the country actually to be addressing the UN General Assembly in Hindi after Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji. And he has made his all the 4 addresses, including today's one, in Hindi. So what do you have to say on that?
In fact, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the first Prime Minister to make his speech in Hindi, and before that, when in 1977 under Morarji Janata Party government, Mr. Vajpayee was the Foreign Minister, then again he had also made his speech in Hindi, then Sushma Swaraj also made her speeches in Hindi, but Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Prime Minister Narendra Modi have been consistently addressing the United Nations in Hindi, and that has been appreciated by the people of India, but also all over the world, wherever the people of Indian origin are, they feel a sense of pride in it that the Prime Minister was addressing the world body in India's own language. So I think it's a great achievement as far as we Indians are concerned, and we should be proud of that.
Prime Minister actually enumerated, he mentioned many of the schemes that have been introduced at the home front, and he mentioned reform, perform and transform as the mantra that has been adopted by the government to bring the change in the human lives here in the country. He mentioned about the open defecation free scheme that has been introduced by the government. He then talked about the Ayushman Bharat scheme and the banking scheme that has led to inclusive banking of many Indians. When you compare to the narrative that the neighboring country yesterday in its speech has been trying to build up, how do you compare both the speeches?
Prime Minister has always been emphasizing on an inclusive development, growth of not only of India but the entire South Asian region. And in that context, he said that our philosophy, our traditional values and our culture has always been reaching us for peace, security and development and human good, human values. And in that context, he traced India's role in dealing with all these problems, whether it is arms smuggling, whether it is drug or whether it is money laundering. And also, you very rightly mentioned, he said that our mantra is reform, perform and transform, and that is exactly what we have been doing, and that is how we have brought about a change in the life of Indians. Then he listed the achievements which Government of India or India has done in the last 5 years, as I said earlier, about the welfare scheme, whether it is about cleanliness, whether it is OFD, or whether it is drinking water, or whether it is banking or digitalization, and on all these fronts the progress which India has made in the last 5 years. That list was given to the world community by the Prime Minister, and that was basically to assert that we now are a country with 130 million people who can contribute. And in that context, I think reference to the Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign was very, very significant, because the self-reliant India, he said, will not be only for the good of people of India, but it will be for the entire humanity, particularly our neighbors and all the developing countries also. So in a way, the Prime Minister today was representing the entire developing world. As a leader of the developing countries, he was presenting a very, very positive picture before the world, what India has done, India has achieved over the last 5 years.
Mr. Tandon, if I were to ask you, how do you assess India's stand and PM's today's address on the eve of India actually taking a seat at the powerful UN Security Council as an elected non-permanent member for a 2-year term beginning 1st January next year? How do you assess this, and especially in relation to India's image at the World Forum that the country has been building? You talk about the International Solar Alliance, or you talk about introducing the International Day of Yoga or International Day of Non-Violence. How do you assess that?
He said, after listing India's contribution to the world body, whether it was in respect of UN peacekeeping force in 50 countries, etc., he said, now when we assume this seat on the UN Security Council, our role will be the same. Our role will be for the good of the society, good of humanity. We will be helping others, and we will be raising all those issues which concern the developing country. And our approach will be of the global good, Jan Kalyan, Vishwa Shanti, peace, security and development. And our development journey in the last 5 years also, he said, has been for the good of the people, and that development journey is now being shared with the rest of the world. We have played a role, so we will continue to play that role during our term as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we will be taking up all the concerns of our region and also of the developing countries. So he assured the world body that as non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, our role will be the same which we have been playing over the last 75 years. But the fact remains that India has not got its due so far in the decision-making process. That is permanent membership of the UN Security Council, and we do hope that during the session, India will get support from a large number of countries for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council.
Thank you, Mr. Tandon.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on Prime Minister's address at United Nations General Assembly. The participants were Ashok Tandon, political analyst, and AIR correspondent Anand Chaturvedi. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.com. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsttalks@gmail.com.